On the banks of the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan, where water once powered mills that ground grain for frontier settlers, where Native Americans had fished for centuries before European settlement, where the natural landscape of Michigan's oak forests met the emerging industrial sprawl of Detroit's western suburbs, there stands a mansion that embodies one of history's most profound contradictions. A palatial estate built by a man who claimed to despise wealth and privilege, who positioned himself as champion of the common worker, who revolutionized industry by making automobiles affordable to the masses, but who simultaneously created for himself a private empire of such vast scale and meticulous control that it revealed the authoritarian impulses lurking beneath his populist rhetoric. For Fair Lane, the estate that Henry Ford built between 1914 and 1915 on a 1,300-acre property carved from Michigan woodland, was never merely a house but was rather a complete world unto itself. A self-sufficient empire where Ford could exercise absolute control over every detail from the architecture to the landscaping to the generation of electricity, where he could retreat from the public gaze while simultaneously conducting the business of the Ford Motor Company, where he could perform the role of simple farmer and nature lover while commanding servants and maintaining a lifestyle that contradicted everything he claimed to believe, and the central mystery that haunts Fair Lane, that echoes through its carefully preserved rooms and its now public gardens, is this: how could a man who built his fortune and reputation on democratizing consumption, on bringing industrial products within reach of ordinary workers, on paying the famous $5 a day wage that seemed to signal genuine concern for employee welfare, how could this same man create a private estate that embodied values fundamentally opposed to democracy, that concentrated power and resources in service of one man's vision, that revealed his deep contempt for many of the very people he claimed to serve? And the answer exposes uncomfortable truths not just about Henry Ford but about American capitalism itself, about the way democratic rhetoric can mask authoritarian impulses, about how industrial fortunes accumulated through exploitation can be sanitized through carefully constructed public images, about the gap between the values capitalists profess and the values their actions reveal, and about how buildings like Fair Lane function as monuments not to their owners' stated ideals but to their actual priorities. And to understand these contradictions, to see how Fair Lane became both celebration and betrayal of everything Ford claimed to represent, we must begin not with the mansion but with the man, with Henry Ford's origins as son of Michigan farmers, with his early mechanical aptitude and his obsessive drive to create a practical automobile, with his founding of the Ford Motor Company in 1903 and his introduction of the Model T in 1908. That utilitarian vehicle that would transform American life by making personal transportation affordable to millions, and Ford, understanding instinctively that mass production required mass consumption, that he could only sell millions of cars if millions of people could afford them, pioneered manufacturing techniques that drove down costs while simultaneously raising wages, creating the famous $5 day in 1914 that seemed to herald new relationship between capital and labor, between owners and workers. And Ford's public image during this period was carefully cultivated as champion of the common man, as industrialist who understood that prosperity must be shared, as visionary who saw that workers were also consumers and that their purchasing power drove economic growth, and this image, promoted through extensive publicity and genuinely believed by millions of Americans who revered Ford as hero of the working class, made him one of the most admired figures in early 20th century America. But this public Ford, this champion of democracy and shared prosperity, existed in profound tension with the private Ford, the man who was simultaneously planning Fair Lane, who was designing an estate that would embody his total control, his desire for self-sufficiency that bordered on paranoia, his need to dominate every aspect of his environment, and his actual contempt for many of the people he employed and for democracy itself. For Ford, despite his populist rhetoric, was deeply authoritarian, believed in hierarchy and control, mistrusted democracy and collective action, despised unions with a passion that would later turn violent, and viewed himself as exceptional being whose genius and vision entitled him to power and wealth that he would deny to others, and Fair Lane, far more than any public statement, reveals these true values, shows what Ford actually believed as opposed to what he claimed to believe, demonstrates through architecture and landscaping and organizational structure the kind of world he actually wanted to create, which was not democratic at all but was rather feudal, was model of benevolent dictatorship where one superior man controlled everything and everyone else existed to serve his vision, and the mansion itself, designed by architect William Van Tyne working under Ford's obsessive supervision, embodied these values in every detail, was 56-room limestone structure that combined Prairie School influences with Scottish baronial elements, that featured massive stone construction suggesting permanence and power, that included not just family living spaces but extensive workshops where Ford could tinker with mechanical projects, that incorporated powerhouse generating electricity from water rights Ford had purchased on the Rouge River, that commanded views over carefully landscaped grounds that Ford controlled as thoroughly as he controlled his factories. And the construction process itself revealed Ford's character, his need to oversee every decision, his inability to delegate or trust others' judgment, his conviction that only he understood how things should be done, and the result was building that functioned as physical manifestation of Ford's ego, as three-dimensional expression of his belief in his own superiority, as monument to the proposition that exceptional men deserve exceptional circumstances. And this directly contradicted everything Ford said publicly about equality and democracy and the dignity of common workers. Revealed that he viewed himself as fundamentally different from and superior to the people who worked in his factories, and that the $5 day and the affordable Model T were not expressions of egalitarian values but were rather tactical decisions, calculated moves to create stable workforce and consumer base, and fair lane, because it was private domain where Ford did not need to maintain public image, showed his true priorities and values, and what it showed was man obsessed with control, with self-sufficiency, with creating environment where he answered to no one and everyone answered to him, and the estate's operations reflected this obsession, with extensive staff including gardeners and housekeepers and mechanics and security personnel, all subject to Ford's direct supervision and none allowed the kind of autonomy or dignity that his public rhetoric suggested workers deserved. And the contradiction between how Ford treated his household staff and how he claimed to value workers reveals that his concern for labor was never about human dignity but was always purely instrumental, was about creating conditions that served his business interests, and when those interests changed, when unions began organizing his factories in the 1930s, when workers demanded actual power rather than simply paternalistic wages, Ford revealed his true character by unleashing brutal violence against organizers, by employing thugs and spies to intimidate workers, by fighting unionization with viciousness that shocked even contemporary observers, and this violence, this authoritarian response to workers seeking democratic voice in workplace, was entirely consistent with the values embodied in Fair Lane, was logical extension of the control and hierarchy that the estate represented, for a man who built himself private empire where his word was absolute law was never going to tolerate workers claiming power in his factories, was never going to accept that people he viewed as inferiors might have rights to challenge his decisions, and the tragedy is that so many people failed to see this, failed to recognize that Fair Lane revealed Ford's true values, continued to believe the public image even as his actions contradicted it, and this failure of perception reveals something important about how power operates in capitalist societies, about how wealth allows construction of favorable public images that mask uncomfortable realities, about how buildings like Fair Lane can remain relatively invisible, can function as private domains that escape public scrutiny, while carefully managed publicity creates false impressions of their owners' values and character, and Ford was particularly skilled at this manipulation, was genius not just of manufacturing but of public relations, understood instinctively how to craft image that resonated with American values of individualism and opportunity and democracy even while building empire that embodied opposite values. And Fair Lane was crucial to this project because it was simultaneously hidden and visible, was private estate that public rarely saw but whose existence nonetheless contributed to Ford's image as successful man who had earned his wealth, and the fact that the estate's scale and operations contradicted his populist rhetoric was not widely recognized during his lifetime, was not part of public conversation about Ford, and this allowed the contradiction to persist, allowed Ford to maintain his reputation as friend of workers while living as feudal lord, and this matters because Ford was not exceptional but was rather typical of American industrialists, was representative of broader pattern where capitalist titans accumulated vast fortunes while claiming to serve public interest, where private empires were built while democratic rhetoric was deployed, where authoritarian control was exercised while freedom was celebrated, and Fair Lane, as physical embodiment of these contradictions, becomes important not just as Ford's house but as symbol of broader hypocrisy at heart of American Capitalism, and understanding this requires looking at specific features of the estate, at how it functioned and what that functioning reveals, and perhaps most significant was the powerhouse that Ford built on the Rouge River, this obsession with self-sufficiency that drove him to generate his own electricity rather than connecting to public utilities. And this was not merely practical decision but was rather ideological statement, was Ford asserting his independence from public infrastructure. His refusal to be dependent on systems he did not control, his determination to create completely autonomous domain, and this obsession with self-sufficiency extended to other aspects of estate, to the extensive gardens that were meant to provide food, to the workshops where Ford could manufacture whatever he needed, to the security measures that kept the public at distance. And all of this reveals man who fundamentally mistrusted interconnection and mutual dependence that characterize democratic societies, who wanted to opt out of social contract, who sought to create private kingdom where he made all rules, and this authoritarian impulse, this desire for complete control, was masked in Ford's public statements by rhetoric of self-reliance and independence that resonated with American individualist ideology. But Fair Lane reveals that Ford's self-reliance was not democratic individualism but was rather aristocratic autonomy, was not about every person having independence but was about one exceptional person having independence while others remained dependent on him, and this distinction is crucial, exposes how language of individualism can be deployed to justify hierarchy and concentration of power, and Fair Lane stands as monument to this ideological sleight of hand, and the estate's fate after Ford's death in 1947 is itself revealing, for Clara Ford, Henry's widow, continued living there until her death in 1950. But the estate proved impossible to maintain as private residence, was too large, too expensive, required too much staff, and reflected values that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain in post-war America, and in 1957 the property was given to the University of Michigan Dearborn, was transformed from private estate into institutional property, and this transition from private to institutional use mirrors similar transformations at other industrial-era estates. Reflects broader pattern where mansions built by first-generation industrialists could not be maintained by their heirs, where the fortunes that built them were dissipated or transformed, where the values they embodied became obsolete or embarrassing, and Fair Lane's current existence as house museum operated by university represents attempt to preserve the building while somehow making sense of what it represents, and this interpretive challenge is significant, for how should we present Fair Lane to contemporary visitors, how should we tell Ford's story? How do we acknowledge his genuine industrial innovations and his impact on American life while also confronting the authoritarianism, the anti-Semitism that darkened his later years, the brutal labor practices, the profound gap between his democratic rhetoric and his aristocratic lifestyle? And the answer unfortunately is that Fair Lane's interpretation has too often taken easy path, has focused on Ford as genius inventor and successful businessman, has celebrated the mansion's architecture and craftsmanship, has presented the estate as expression of Ford's taste and vision, but has largely avoided difficult questions about what Fair Lane reveals about Ford's actual values, about the contradiction between his public image and private reality, about the exploitation that funded the estate's construction and maintenance, about the authoritarian impulses that shaped its design and operations, and this interpretive choice. This decision to present Ford sympathetically and to minimize uncomfortable aspects of his character and career, represents failure similar to Dunrobin's failure to confront the clearances, represents another example of heritage sites choosing comfortable myths over difficult truths, and this matters because Ford remains important figure in American consciousness, remains symbol of industrial innovation and American success, remains part of national mythology about entrepreneurship and opportunity, and if sites like Fair Lane cannot or will not complicate this mythology, cannot or will not reveal the darker aspects of Ford's character and the contradictions in his legacy, then they are contributing to false historical consciousness, are allowing myths to substitute for reality, are failing in their educational responsibility, and this failure is particularly significant given contemporary relevance of questions Fair Lane raises about relationship between wealth and democracy, about whether concentrated economic power is compatible with democratic values, about how we should regard industrial titans who accumulate vast fortunes while claiming to serve public interest, about the role of labor and workers' rights in democratic society, and about whether the kind of control and autonomy that Fair Lane represents, the ability to opt out of public systems, to create private domain governed by private rules, is compatible with democratic citizenship and social solidarity, and these questions, far from being merely historical, are absolutely central to contemporary political debates about inequality and corporate power and the rights of workers versus the rights of capital, and fair lane, properly interpreted, could illuminate. These debates could help visitors understand historical roots of contemporary conflicts, could demonstrate that tensions between capital and labor, between concentrated wealth and democratic values, between private autonomy and public interest, are not new but have characterized American capitalism from its origins. But achieving this kind of interpretation would require fair lane's operators to move beyond celebration of Ford's achievements, to confront his authoritarianism and his moral failures, to acknowledge that the mansion represents not just industrial success but also the anti-democratic values that accompanied that success, and to use the estate as space for critical examination rather than simply as monument to Ford's genius, and there is little evidence that this kind of reinterpretation is planned or even contemplated. Little indication that fair lane will move beyond its current comfortable presentation, and this represents abandonment similar to what we see at Dunrobin, represents decision to preserve building while suppressing the fuller truth about what it represents, and this abandonment matters because it allows myths to persist, allows Ford to continue being celebrated without adequate recognition of his moral failures, allows his legacy to be sanitized in ways that obscure important historical truths, and prevents the estate from serving its highest possible purpose as educational tool that could help contemporary visitors think critically about wealth and power. And the reasons for this abandonment are probably similar to reasons for Dunrobin's failure: institutional inertia, limited resources, dependence on donations and visitor revenue that might be threatened by controversial interpretation, desire to maintain good relationships with Ford family descendants and with Ford Motor Company, which remains major presence in Michigan, and general reluctance to criticize figure as celebrated as Henry Ford. But these reasons, while they explain the failure, do not justify it, do not make abandonment acceptable, and the question becomes what would be required to move fair lane toward more honest interpretation, what would need to change to transform it from monument to Ford's genius into more complex exploration of his character and legacy, and the answer involves similar elements to what would be required at Dunrobin: pressure from below, from scholars and educators and community members who insist on fuller truth, media attention that exposes gap between current interpretation and historical reality, political will to prioritize education over celebration, and institutional courage to risk controversy in service of honesty. And there are some signs that conversation about Ford is changing, that his anti-Semitism and his brutal labor practices are receiving more attention, that the mythology surrounding him is being questioned, but this has not yet translated into significant changes in how fair lane is interpreted, has not yet transformed the visitor experience in ways that would adequately confront the contradictions Ford embodied, and until such changes occur, fair lane will remain another example of abandoned truth, another heritage site that preserves architecture while suppressing meaning, another beautiful building that tells comfortable lies, and the hidden empire of Ford will remain partially hidden, will continue to exist in public consciousness as symbol of American innovation and success rather than as more complicated monument to the tensions between democracy and autocracy, between proclaimed values and actual practices, between public rhetoric and private reality, that characterized Ford's life and career. And this partial visibility, this selective memory, this suppression of uncomfortable truths, serves particular interests: those who benefit from myths about entrepreneurship and individual genius, those who want to minimize questions about labor rights and corporate power, those who prefer simple narratives about American success over complex examinations of American contradictions. But this serves public interest in honest history and critical understanding, and fair lane, standing on its grounds in Dearborn, its limestone walls solid and permanent, its powerhouse still visible though no longer generating electricity, its gardens maintained though no longer feeding a private household, its rooms preserved as they were when Ford lived there, continues to exist in this state of partial truth, continues to be presented as monument to genius without adequate acknowledgement of the authoritarian impulses and moral failures that genius accompanied, continues to allow visitors to admire without fully understanding, continues to celebrate without adequately critiquing, and in this it remains hidden empire, not because the public cannot visit, the estate is open for tours, but because what the estate reveals about Ford and about American capitalism remains partially obscured, remains incompletely acknowledged, remains abandoned by those responsible for interpreting it, and this abandonment, like all abandonments of historical truth, has costs, perpetuates myths, distorts understanding, prevents the kind of critical historical consciousness that democratic societies require, and ensures that Fair Lane, despite its preservation and despite its accessibility, cannot serve its full potential as space for examining one of America's most important and most contradictory historical figures, and so the mansion stands, monument to genius and to authoritarianism, to innovation and to exploitation, to democratic rhetoric and to aristocratic reality, to the man who claimed to serve the people while building himself an empire, and to the ongoing failure of American society to fully reckon with the contradictions between its proclaimed values and its actual distribution of wealth and power, and Fair Lane remains, visible but hidden, preserved but abandoned, monument to everything we have not yet fully confronted about Henry Ford and about ourselves, and to understand the full depth of this abandonment, the complete scope of what remains unexamined in Fair Lane's interpretation, we must look more closely at the specific contradictions that the estate embodies and that contemporary presentation largely ignores, beginning with the fundamental tension between Ford's public championing of the common worker and his private life of extraordinary privilege. For the man who famously said that history is bunk, who positioned himself as forward-thinking modern industrialist unconcerned with aristocratic pretensions, who claimed to value simplicity and practicality over ostentation, built for himself an estate whose scale and complexity rivaled anything created by the European nobility he claimed to despise, and this was not merely hypocrisy in the personal sense, not simply matter of one man failing to live by his own stated values, but was rather systematic contradiction that reveals deeper truths about how industrial capitalism operates, about how vast fortunes are accumulated through exploitation of labor while that exploitation is masked by rhetoric about opportunity and shared prosperity, and Fair Lane, in its very existence, in its 56 rooms and its 1,300 acres and its private powerhouse and its extensive staff, materially demonstrates that the $5-day wage that made Ford famous was never about genuinely sharing wealth, was never about creating actual equality, but was rather about paying workers just enough to pacify them while Ford and his family accumulated resources on scale that dwarfed anything his employees could imagine, and the arithmetic of this is stark and revealing. While Ford paid his assembly line workers $5 per day, he was spending millions on Fair Lane, was creating for himself lifestyle that consumed in 1 year what his workers would earn in multiple lifetimes. And this vast disparity, this concentration of wealth in one family while thousands of workers remained relatively poor despite their groundbreaking wages, exposes the fundamental inequality at the heart of capitalism, exposes how even seemingly generous wages leave workers with tiny fraction of the value they create while owners accumulate vast surpluses, and Fair Lane stands as three-dimensional proof of this extraction, as built evidence of where the profits went, as architectural answer to the question of who actually benefited from Ford's industrial innovations, and contemporary interpretation that focuses on Ford's genius and his contributions to American prosperity without adequately confronting this extractive relationship, without making visible how the mansion was built on the unpaid labor value of Ford's workers, without acknowledging that every room represents wealth that could have been distributed to employees but was instead concentrated in one man's hands, is interpretation that obscures rather than illuminates essential truths about American economic history. And this obscuring serves ideological purposes, supports contemporary arguments against wealth redistribution and labor rights by allowing Ford to be celebrated as benefactor rather than exposed as exploiter, and the abandonment of honest interpretation at Fair Lane thus has political consequences that extend far beyond the site itself, shapes how Americans think about the relationship between capital and labor, between employers and employees, between individual success and collective welfare, and perpetuates myths that serve the wealthy by disguising the mechanisms through which they accumulate and maintain their fortunes, and this is why Fair Lane matters, why its interpretation is not merely academic question but is rather political issue with real stakes, and why the current abandonment of fuller truth represents failure not just of historical scholarship but of democratic education. And beyond the basic contradiction between Ford's worker-friendly rhetoric and his mansion-dwelling reality, there are other specific aspects of Fair Lane that reveal uncomfortable truths about Ford's character and values that current interpretation largely avoids, most notably his virulent anti-Semitism, which was not merely personal prejudice but was rather systematically promoted through the Dearborn Independent, the newspaper Ford owned and used to publish years of anti-Semitic propaganda, including American publication of the fraudulent protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this anti-Semitism, which influenced Nazi ideology and for which Ford received Nazi Germany's highest civilian honor in 1938, represents profound moral failure that cannot be separated from his other achievements, cannot be dismissed as merely man of his time or as unfortunate side note to otherwise admirable career, but must be understood as revealing something essential about Ford's character, about his paranoia and his need for scapegoats and his attraction to conspiracy theories and his fundamental inability to accept that his workers' grievances might be legitimate rather than result of outside agitation, and Fair Lane was the place where Ford held meetings with anti-Semitic propagandists, where he planned campaigns against Jewish influence, where he entertained visitors who shared his hatreds, and the building thus is not merely monument to industrial success but is also site where moral evil was plotted, and this dimension of the estate's history is almost entirely absent from contemporary interpretation, is mentioned if at all only in passing, is treated as embarrassing footnote rather than as central element of Ford's character that must be confronted in any honest assessment, and this avoidance represents profound failure, represents decision to sanitize Ford's legacy by minimizing aspects that make him difficult to celebrate, and this sanitization allows visitors to admire Fair Lane and Ford's achievements without grappling with the reality that genius and innovation can coexist with moral depravity, that the same mind that revolutionized manufacturing could embrace murderous prejudice, that we cannot simply celebrate the achievements while ignoring the atrocities, and the failure to confront Ford's anti-Semitism at Fair Lane is particularly troubling given contemporary resurgence of anti-Semitic violence and ideology, given that understanding historical roots and manifestations of anti-Semitism is crucial educational task, and given that Ford's promotion of anti-Semitic propaganda had real consequences including influencing Nazi ideology and contributing to climate that enabled the Holocaust, and allowing Fair Lane to present Ford without adequate acknowledgement of this aspect of his legacy is not neutral historical interpretation but is rather active suppression of crucial truth, is choice to protect Ford's reputation at expense of honest education, and this choice has victims, dishonors those who suffered from the prejudice Ford promoted, and fails visitors who deserve to understand full complexity of historical figures rather than being presented with sanitized versions that obscure moral failures, and beyond the anti-Semitism, there is also question of Ford's brutal opposition to labor organizing, his use of private security force under Harry Bennett that intimidated and assaulted workers who attempted to unionize, his resistance to collective bargaining that lasted until 1941 when he was finally forced to recognize the UAW. And this violent opposition to workers having democratic voice in their workplace contradicts everything Ford claimed about valuing workers and represents authoritarian impulse that was entirely consistent with the values embodied in Fair Lane, entirely predictable from a man who built himself private empire where he exercised absolute control, and yet this too is largely absent from Fair Lane's interpretation, is not presented as central element of Ford's character but is rather minimized or omitted. And this allows the $5 day to be celebrated without acknowledgement that Ford's concern for workers was always purely instrumental, was always contingent on their submission to his authority, and evaporated the moment they sought actual power, and understanding this is crucial to understanding both Ford and American labor history, is necessary for grasping why unions fought so hard for recognition despite violent opposition, why workers did not simply accept paternalistic wages as adequate but demanded voice and dignity and democratic rights in workplace, and why the mythology of benevolent capitalism represented by Ford's carefully constructed image was always a lie that obscured extractive and authoritarian reality, and Fair Lane could be teaching site for these lessons, could be space where visitors learn about the gap between capitalist rhetoric and capitalist practice, between proclaimed concern for workers and actual treatment of them, between the public image Ford cultivated and the private man who built this estate, but instead it functions largely as celebration, as monument that honors without adequately questioning, as preservation of architecture without preservation of critical memory, and this represents abandonment of Fair Lane's potential as educational resource, abandonment of responsibility to tell difficult truths, An abandonment ultimately of the workers whose labor created Ford's wealth but whose stories are marginalized, an interpretation that focuses on one great man rather than on the collective labor that made his greatness possible, and this brings us to perhaps the most profound abandonment at Fair Lane, the erasure of the workers who built and maintained the estate, the servants and gardeners and mechanics whose labor made Ford's lifestyle possible but whose names and stories are almost entirely absent from the site's interpretation, for Fair Lane, like all great estates, required extensive staff to function, required people to cook and clean and maintain the grounds and operate the powerhouse and provide all the services that allowed the Fords to live in comfort, and these people, though essential to the estate's operation, are invisible in contemporary presentation, are not named, are not acknowledged as individuals with their own lives and stories and experiences, are reduced to anonymous background, to the invisible hands that maintained visible splendor, and this erasure is not unique to Fair Lane but is rather common pattern at historic house museums that present aristocratic or wealthy lifestyles. Pattern of focusing on owners and their possessions while ignoring the workers who made those lifestyles possible, and this pattern reflects and reinforces class hierarchies, suggests that wealthy owners are historically important while workers are not, that the lives of the powerful matter while the lives of those who serve them do not, and this is precisely the ideology that Ford himself promoted, the belief that exceptional individuals like himself deserve to command resources and attention while ordinary workers should remain anonymous and subordinate. And when Fair Lane's interpretation reproduces this hierarchy, when it centers Ford and marginalizes workers, it is not presenting neutral history but is rather actively promoting particular class-based understanding of who matters and whose stories deserve to be told, and this is especially ironic given Ford's public rhetoric about valuing workers, creates situation where the man who claimed to champion the common worker is honored at a site that erases the common workers who actually served him, and this irony should be acknowledged and explored rather than simply reproduced. Should become part of the site's interpretation rather than remaining unexamined assumption, and addressing this would require research into who actually worked at Fair Lane, what their lives were like, what wages they received, what their working conditions were, how they experienced service in the Ford household, and how their labor related to the labor of Ford Motor Company employees. And this research would almost certainly reveal uncomfortable truths about exploitation and hierarchy, about the gap between Ford's treatment of his household staff and his public rhetoric about workers, about the multiple tiers of labor that supported his lifestyle, and about the invisibility and powerlessness of domestic workers, and these truths deserve to be part of Fair Lane's story, deserve to be told alongside the architectural history and the celebration of Ford's achievements, deserve to be made visible rather than remaining hidden, and the failure to pursue this research, the decision to continue presenting Fair Lane primarily as Ford's achievement without adequate acknowledgement of workers' contributions, represents ongoing abandonment, ongoing choice to privilege comfortable narratives over complex truths, and this abandonment matters because it affects how we think about work and value and whose contributions to history we recognize, shapes our understanding of how wealth is created and maintained, and influences contemporary debates about domestic labor and service work and the dignity and rights of all workers regardless of their position in economic hierarchy, and Fair Lane, if honestly interpreted, if workers were centered rather than marginalized, could become space for thinking about these issues, could help visitors understand that grand estates require vast amounts of invisible labor, that wealthy lifestyles depend on service workers whose contributions are rarely acknowledged, and that the mythology of self-made men like Ford obscures the reality that no one succeeds alone, that all wealth depends on collective labor, and that economic hierarchies that concentrate resources at the top while leaving workers relatively poor are not natural or inevitable but are rather social constructions that can and should be questioned, but achieving this kind of interpretation would require fundamental rethinking of how Fair Lane is presented, would require moving beyond great man history to social history, would require treating Ford not as hero to be celebrated but as historical figure to be understood in full complexity including his moral failures and his dependence on others' labor, and would require acknowledging that the mansion's beauty and Ford's achievements do not erase or justify the exploitation and authoritarianism that accompanied them, and there is little indication that Fair Lane's current operators are prepared to undertake this kind of reinterpretation, little evidence that they recognize the inadequacy of current approach, and much suggestion that they are comfortable with current presentation that celebrates Ford while minimizing uncomfortable aspects of his legacy, and this comfort with abandonment, this acceptance of partial truth as sufficient, reflects broader patterns in American heritage tourism and museum interpretation where economic pressures and institutional conservatism and reluctance to offend donors or visitors combine to produce presentations that avoid controversy, that present history in ways that do not challenge powerful contemporary interests, that privilege comfort over honesty, and that ultimately serve to mystify rather than illuminate the workings of power and wealth, and Fair Lane exemplifies these patterns, demonstrates how even institutions that claim educational missions can function as propaganda, can promote myths about American capitalism and individual achievement and the beneficence of the wealthy that serve ideological purposes while obscuring historical realities. And recognizing this, understanding how heritage sites like Fair Lane actively shape historical consciousness in ways that serve particular interests, is crucial for anyone concerned with democratic education and informed citizenship, for if we cannot rely on museums and historic sites to tell us the truth about the past, if these institutions instead present sanitized versions that protect the powerful and erase the powerless, then we are left without reliable sources for understanding how we got to our present condition, without tools for thinking critically about economic structures and social hierarchies, without capacity to imagine alternatives to current arrangements because we have false understanding of how those arrangements came to be, and this is profound loss, represents failure of public education with serious consequences for democratic culture, and Fair Lane's abandonment of honest interpretation thus matters far beyond Dearborn, far beyond questions of how one mansion presents one industrialist, matters as example of broader failure that affects how Americans understand their history and their society. And addressing this failure requires not just changes at Fair Lane but broader rethinking of how we do heritage interpretation, what purposes historic sites should serve, what responsibilities museums have to their visitors and to historical truth, and what it means to preserve buildings while abandoning honest engagement with what those buildings represent. And these are questions that extend to Dunrobin and Chantilly and Hempstead House and every other site where uncomfortable truths are suppressed in favor of comfortable myths, questions that go to heart of how societies remember their pasts and what they learn from that remembering, and Fair Lane, standing on the Rouge River with its limestone walls solid and its powerhouse silent and its gardens maintained for visitors who come to see where Henry Ford lived, remains monument to these unresolved questions, remains testament to both Ford's achievements and his moral failures, remains evidence of American capitalism's contradictions between democratic rhetoric and authoritarian practice, and remains, most fundamentally, abandoned truth waiting for honest interpretation, waiting for institution brave enough to tell full story, waiting for society mature enough to confront complexity of its heroes, and until that honesty and bravery and maturity emerge, Fair Lane will remain hidden empire, not hidden because it is private, it is open to the public, but hidden because what it reveals about Ford and about American capitalism remains partially obscured, partially suppressed, partially abandoned by those charged with interpreting it, and in this abandonment it stands with other compromised monuments to wealth and power, stands as reminder that preservation is not enough, that buildings can be maintained while truths are erased, that architectural heritage can be celebrated while moral reckonings are avoided, and that the hidden empire of Ford, built on worker exploitation and maintained by authoritarian control and stained by anti-Semitic hatred and violent opposition to labor rights, remains partially hidden still, remains inadequately confronted in the mansion that bears his name, and will remain so until we find the courage to abandon the abandonment, to reject the comfortable lies, to embrace the difficult truths, and to use Fair Lane not as monument to one man's genius but as lens through which to examine the costs and contradictions of American industrial capitalism, the gap between democratic ideals and economic realities, and the ongoing struggle to build society where wealth is more equitably distributed, where workers have dignity and power, where great fortunes are not built on exploitation, and where the mansions of the rich, if they exist at all, tell honest stories about how they were built and what they represent rather than standing as beautiful lies that obscure the human cost of their splendor.